Indeed, it said that Titanic would clean Phillips out at the poker tables, but still the inebriated heir apparently still had not had enough, so he raised the stakes even further by betting the house his father had just built for himself and his family. Titanic, of course, won that hand as well, but he had no real interest in the home as lavish as it was, so the next day he sold the property back to John. As for Laffoon, one of his and Titanic's favorite tricks involved Laffoon starting the day off by pretending to be Titanic's caddy as Titanic faced off against the richest men on the golf course. Titanic would then proceed to lose these contests, at which point, playing the sore loser, he'd demand another game, insisting that he knew he could defeat the other man. In fact, he was so confident that he would win, he gave the other man the opportunity to pick any pro he wanted to be his partner, while Titanic would settle with playing with his own caddy. I think by this point we all know how those games turned out. Yet, even as good as Titanic had apparently gotten at playing the actual game of golf, he also couldn't help himself as he still had a habit of using the same kind of clever tricks he'd been doing since he was a teenager to fool and win money off unsuspecting marks. For example, he had one scheme where if they were playing next to a body of water with a rowboat, he'd make a bet with the people he was with that he could get his ball to land in the boat given X amount of tries. On the first day he'd do this though, Titanic would miss all of his shots until the last, which while actually landing briefly inside the boat, the ball would immediately bounce back out, because that's what golf balls do. The next day, after acting the stubborn gambler who didn't know when to quit, or the type of people he was used to taking advantage of, Titanic would bet his same companions from the previous day that this time he could get his ball to land and stay in the boat. In fact, he was so sure of himself, he was willing to bet 10 times as much as he lost the previous day, and even bet he could do so given less tries. His companions then, thinking there was no way they could lose given what they had seen the previous day, took the bet. And yet when this time he managed to get his ball to land in the rowboat, it didn't bounce out, as this time he had lined the interior with sand. Now, in addition to oil strikes in places like Texas and Oklahoma, the region where Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky meet up at the Ohio River also had its own oil boom in the 30s. This oil strike then made a number of farmers and speculators in the region among the few who were actually doing quite good for themselves during the depths of the Great Depression. So, as always seemed to be the case in those days, when news got out about people in that region being newly flush with money, gamblers soon descended upon the area, looking to entice the newly wealthy into participating in exciting games of chance, with Evansville, Indiana being the heart of where the action was. There would be high-stakes card games happening consistently in local Evansville hotels at the McCurdy and the Vendome, while the Helfrich Municipal Golf Course would play host to any number of games being played for large sums of money. And while there also seemed to always be any number of different kinds of gambling taking place at the local bowling alley and pool hall in town. As a result of such high-stakes action, Titanic Thompson and his young bride would arrive in Evansville sometime in the late 1930s, at which time young Joanne would indulge in her increasing taste for whiskey sours, while Titanic got to talking with a number of gamblers he'd known from the past. This included one Hubert Coates, who Titanic had met back during his time in California. Coates, in fact, would give his fellow gambler a tip. The oilman knew all about Titanic and his reputation. As a result, he wasn't going to find much of any serious action from them. All was not lost, though, as according to Coates, what Titanic could do was take advantage of his overconfident fellow gamblers and take their money which Coates advised Titanic used to buy up some oil leases. Titanic, taking his old friend's advice, then started in the local pool halls, luring in fellow gamblers to make bets by claiming he could make near impossible trick shots. Titanic would reportedly place the cue ball 6 inches away from the 8 ball and bet he could bank the cue ball off of 3 rails before hitting the 8 into the corner pocket. This was apparently an incredibly difficult shot, as it needed near-perfect precision to pull off. It was such a tricky shot that Titanic asserted he could not do it every time, but needed 10 tries to do it. This proclamation typically lured in some bets, at which point to sweeten the deal, Titanic would then try to lure those who hadn't bet yet into wagering that he couldn't do it in just 5 tries. Once all the bets were made, Titanic would then start shooting, and he would of course miss his first 3 or 4 tries, only to make it just in time to win all of his bets. In doing so, Titanic would show that while the shot was possible, it was also still quite difficult. At which point he offered his opponents one more chance, double or nothing, if he could sink the ball in just 3 tries, which he of course did. In addition to his tricks at the pool table, Titanic would also make money playing cards, golfing, and bowling, more often than not against his fellow gamblers. He then turned around and used the money he had won to purchase the oil leases that Cokes tipped him off to. Leases that were soon netting the gambler $200 a day without him having to do anything. Money that in a few years' time could have guaranteed his retirement. The thing was, though, Titanic wasn't into gambling just for the money. Sure, he liked winning money and he liked all the fine things he could buy with it as he lived the high life, but just collecting money didn't really do anything for Titanic, as he needed the risk of losing it and the excitement of taking it from someone else. Indeed, at one point, Titanic was supposedly offered a chance to invest in the incandescent light bulb and didn't, a choice that potentially cost him millions of dollars. The thing was, Thompson, when telling that story, said he did not regret that choice, as while he liked money and liked spending it even more, that kind of gamble did not excite him, nor did he get any excitement out of the promise of easy money coming his way without him having to do anything. There was simply no fun or excitement in such a setup. He lived for the road and for the risk. So, come 1942, Titanic Thompson found himself purchasing a house in Evansville for himself and his now 24-year-old wife Joanne, who apparently still did not see much of her husband, as even when he was staying in town, he would spend most of his time either at the country club playing golf or downtown in Adolph's pool hall, where, as it turns out, he would encounter another legendary gambler, Rudolph Walter Wunderone, who was better known by his nickname Minnesota Fats. Fats is considered to be one of the greatest pool hustlers of all time, and he would prove his skills one day in Evansville when he won $30,000 off the legendary Titanic Thompson himself. Now, apparently Titanic had been warned by Cokes that while he might be a fairly skilled pool player, he was in reality nowhere near Fats' league. Still, Titanic insisted on playing a big money game against him anyway, only realizing the error of his ways after he lost $30,000. Titanic had been beaten, but he'd also met a kindred spirit, as soon Titanic, Fats, and Cokes were hitting the road together. Yet, despite these increasingly frequent trips out of town, the 52-year-old Titanic Thompson would still manage to get his young wife pregnant, a turn of events which the two had distinctly different reactions to. Joanne, you see, wanted the child. She liked the idea of settling down and the idea of having someone around the house. Titanic, meanwhile, did not want the hassle. He did not want to settle down, and nor did he want the responsibility. So he reportedly gave his wife a choice. It was either him or the child, and Joanne chose the child. So they began divorce proceedings, with Joanne insisting on keeping all the oil wells, which was seemingly fine by Titanic. He had never wanted to settle down, and he had never really liked the idea of just passively collecting money. So for him to get free and clear of any future responsibilities concerning the child, he happily signed the dozen deeds to the oil wells that he owned over to Joanne and departed Evansville. In doing so, Titanic, whether consciously or not, was walking the same path as his own gambler father, who had departed shortly after his own birth all those years ago. Although, unlike his father, Titanic at least left his former wife and child with something, rather than taking their last $5 as he left, which is honestly the one good thing you could say about him in this situation. After divorcing Joanne and abandoning his responsibility for the child he had sired, it does not seem that Titanic Thompson was single for very long, as by the time he arrived in Virginia Beach renting out a large oceanfront mansion there, he had yet another young woman for his wife, as the 53-year-old Titanic Thompson was now married to a 16-year-old named Maxine. Maxine, who was described as being a handful, knew how to shoot and was highly competitive. The gambler and his young bride would often spend their days together in Virginia Beach, driving around in his big fancy car acting like movie stars. They would also often go shooting together in the mornings before Titanic departed for the golf course in the afternoon. Now, Maxine would not be alone while her husband was busy plying his trade, as the pair had also brought along her two sisters, Betty and Bonnie, who lived with them in the rented beachfront mansion. The mansion which on weekends would play host to gambling parties that stretched into the next week, As, after all, part of the reason why they were here in the first place was because Titanic had heard about a bunch of high-stakes gambling action, and so he now turned his rented mansion into the center of said action. The locals, however, eventually grew wise to the fact that they were never going to actually beat Titanic Thompson for real, and so the action in Virginia Beach started to dry up. Meanwhile, the old gambler was also seemingly already starting to lose interest in his exceedingly young bride, and so he set off hitting the road again. In doing so, Titanic resumed his old hustle of finding young, talented, and as of yet unknown golfers to partner with. Among those who Titanic would involve in his schemes was Bob Hamilton, who would win the 1944 PGA Championship, Herman Kaiser, who would win the 1946 Masters Championship, and Lee Elder, who would become the first black golfer to play in the Masters. Meanwhile, just because he was away from home and his young wife did not mean that the old gambler did not involve Maxine in his schemes, as he started running a ploy where he bet people that he could call up his psychic friend, a person who he dubbed the Wizard, that Titanic insisted would be able to correctly guess a card that the person he was dealing with had just pulled from the deck. The trick here was when he called and asked if the wizard was there, Maxine on the other end of the line would quietly list off the card suits, hearts, diamonds, etc., until Titanic broke in, interrupting her when she named the right one, as he now asked to speak to the wizard. Maxine then started listing off the various cards, with Titanic interrupting again when she hit the right one, as he now asked the wizard to tell his friend what their card was. Maxine, now fully informed, would tell Titanic's companion exactly the value and suit of the card they were holding, thus winning her husband his wager. Eventually, the aging Titanic, looking for a warmer environment than Virginia Beach, got himself a home in Tucson, Arizona, where Maxine came to join him. The old gambler and his young wife seemed to settle down here somewhat, as both Titanic and Maxine became the state's champion trap shooters. Think a variation of skeet shooting. Everything seemed fine until after 5 years of living together in Tucson, the now 21-year-old Maxine announced that she was pregnant. Then, in a repeat of what happened with Joanne and his own father's behavior, Titanic Thompson, who had no interest in being a father, divorced Maxine and left. Following his divorce, Titanic Thompson didn't seem to waste any time and promptly threw himself a stag party of sorts in his new home. In preparation for this celebration, Titanic also hired 3 teenage girls to act as hostesses for him and his guests. What that means, I have no idea, but what we do know is that some local cops also paid a visit to Titanic's new home after getting a call from an anonymous caller. Upon raiding the home, the cops then found the 61-year-old Titanic Thompson naked with one of the teenage girls. Between finding this disturbing scene and one of the other girls telling the police that she had been groped by one of his guests, Titanic Thompson was arrested on multiple counts of, quote, contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The once legendary gambler, who had at one time been the envy of many who saw his extravagant lifestyle, was now perceived as nothing more than a dirty old man. A dirty old man who would be sentenced to 2 years in the Arizona State Penitentiary. Yet before he headed off to jail, Titanic Thompson would marry his 5th wife. As around this time, the old gambler drove out to Missouri to pay a visit to Byron Bennett, an oil man he had known from years back. Bennett, you see, had an 18-year-old daughter named Jeanette, who had until just recently been attending William Woods College in Fulton, Missouri. Unfortunately, her father's oil wells had subsequently run dry, and so they had no more money for tuition. Which meant Jeanette was back at home when Titanic came driving into town in 1954 in his silver Cadillac, announcing he had come to marry her. As it turns out, this was not the first time Titanic had paid a visit to the Bennetts in recent memory, as 7 years prior to this moment, while he was still married to Maxine, Titanic had dropped in to visit with his friend. During this visit, apparently, Titanic had spent some time entertaining the at the time 11-year-old Jeanette with some card tricks and the like, during which time he reportedly told the 11-year-old that when she got older, he was going to marry her, which is both not okay by any stretch and also exceedingly weird, considering that Maxine was apparently with him on that trip. As for the now 18-year-old Jeanette, she did vaguely sort of remember her father's friend, who had always seemed polite and respectful as he tipped his hat and held doors for his then wife. He also notably appeared to be rich, so while Jeanette seemed to be far from what I would describe as excited by the proposition of marrying this 16-year-old man that she did not know, the way she looked at it is, even if he made it to 80, she herself would still only be 36, with most of her life still ahead of her. So with that in mind, Jeanette agreed, and the two would be married by justice of the peace on the 6th of August, at which point Titanic immediately went out gambling. It then wasn't long after saying their vows that Titanic Thompson had to turn himself in at the Prima County Jail for the aforementioned crimes he had been convicted of. Now, Titanic was supposed to ultimately